Welcome to Quilting's first reality show, live and unscripted with Susan Smith.
Hello and welcome. I am Susan Smith and you're in my studio Stitched by Susan. Today we're bringing to you a live and unscripted episode. So live streaming this project, totally unedited, Quilting's first reality show, right? And in this episode, I'm doing something a little bit new for me. I've been learning this year on my BERNINA Q24, I've been learning the computerized or digitized system, and it's called Q-Matic. That's BERNINA's brand. And so I'm going to do a quilt today that is done with that computerized system. I know a lot of my followers have BERNINAs too, and I get asked a lot of questions about this. So I thought, I'm happy to share what I'm learning. And let me just say, I'm not an expert in it by any means yet, but I've done a few dozen quilts through this system. So today we're going to do one with an edge-to-edge quilting design, but there will be lots of tips for those of you who don't have BERNINAs necessarily. So, loading tips, thread choice tips, keeping the quilt flat and square tips, and then even just some of those digital processes are the same throughout the brands. So hopefully you'll find lots of helpful and useful information, and it'll be a fun and relaxing day to sew together in any event. So feel free to have your own projects going on. Maybe it's your Christmas baking. Maybe you're trying to get a couple last minute things sewn up before the holidays. We're airing this on December 22nd, I believe it is today. I think that's right. So it's almost Christmas time as we air, but I appreciate those of you who took the time to join me. It's going to be a fun morning. Okay, a few things before we launch into it. Number one is I want to tell you about something that's brand new. You've maybe seen it on social media the last couple of weeks or in my newsletter. We are hosting a quilting cruise. So this is happening in January of 2025, so a little over a year away. It's going to be in the Caribbean, and it departs and returns out of Orlando area. So it's a Port Canaveral, to be specific. A couple people have asked. Orlando doesn't have a port, but the cruise line says leaving and returning to Orlando. Anyway, Celebrity Cruise Line, Equinox is the ship. You can find all the information if you're interested on our website. It's SBS Experiences. So Mr. Producer will put that in the show notes for you because you got to spell it right. Or not in the show notes, I'm sorry, just in the chat. So you can scroll down through that and find that website and find more information. But basically it's this. I'll be teaching on it, and I've invited two other teachers to join me, Beth Ann Nemesh, who is a beautiful, artistic, incredibly skilled machine quilter, and Sam Alberts, who is kind of an up-and-coming quilter. She's a YouTuber as well. She's kind of just getting going the last year or two on YouTube, but she's a very creative custom quilter. More modern in taste, but she's incredibly creative. Like, she does different things than I'm seeing, in the quilting world the last 5 or 10 years. So just a fresh take on some quilting designs and fresh new ideas. So the three of us are working together to bring you classes that represent our own individual style, but that really work together and build together so that you can apply what you learn in one to the next one, et cetera, et cetera. So you get this cohesive blend of classes. In addition, the three of us are all business entrepreneurs. Quilting is our business. And so we're going to have a selection of business breakouts, we call them. So they're entirely optional, and they're smaller and more informal, but they'll be talking about various business-related topics. So like using social media to build your business, or creating pricing and communicating with your clients, or in Sam's case, she lives in an extremely remote area in southern British Columbia, Canada, how she's building a business when she doesn't have a physical clientele that's near to her, and she's doing it with great success. So lots of tips there. Also, we have a couple special people along on the cruise. One of them is a friend of ours who's a videographer, and he has worked in Hollywood actually for a number of years. And throughout today's show, you might want to watch a little bit the bigger picture. You'll see some of the lighting and some of the larger shots. So he's the one that helped us set up that lighting and our cameras to get, the clearest possible, the best lighting possible, dealing with vibration, dealing with moving needles, all these things that most people who are videoing don't have to deal with. He's been really helpful in all of that. So he's going to be along on the cruise. And number one, his name is Clement Lai. He's going to be videoing all the classes so that you'll have access to them after the cruise. And I should be specific, those who come on the cruise have access to them after the cruise. So he's videoing and recording all those classes for your later rewatching. And also he's going to be doing one of these business breakouts. So some help for you if you're taking photographs or videoing some of your work, creating reels, creating YouTube videos, whatever you might be interested in doing. And we have at least one other Spotlight teacher that will be coming, yet to be determined. So watch for notes on that. Yeah, so lots of information on that. So once again, look in the chat for a link to the website, SBS Experiences. There's lots of information about the cruise and the ship, the various rooms and so forth. Okay, we're just about winding down here and getting started. One more thing I want to mention. YouTube, as always, is free for everyone to view. You pay by watching ads. But if in case you do want to support the show, you can do that easily by going to buymeacoffee.com/Stitched by Susan. And there, for as little as $5, you can make a one-time contribution, or if you wish, you can commit to a monthly subscription. And we appreciate all of that. And every penny there goes toward increasing our lighting and our camera professionalism. So we're always looking to better the show. Okay, let's get on with the show, you guys. I'm going to take one more sip of coffee and away we'll go. All right, so today we are working on a small quilt. Dave, can I see my view, if possible? Sorry, we're communicating here on the side. Today we're working on a smallish quilt because I don't want... The quilting is not the big thing today. The big thing is going to be the setup and the planning. So it's a smaller project, so the quilting time will not be as large. And while the machine is quilting, we'll have opportunities to take questions and chat about it. So feel free to ask your questions at any time. If you preface them with a QQ in front, that really helps us because we sometimes get hundreds of comments, and that double Q allows us to search for them. One Q won't do because then we get every word that has quilt in it, right? So QQ, and that will bring the questions to the top and we can find them easily and answer them for you. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to grab the backing and a couple notes about this. You know that my projects here are very frequently client quilts, right? So they're not made for this show. This is just the type of real quilt that comes into my studio. And in this case, Laura is the piecer, and she often pieces her backings as well. So you can only see part of it, I know, in the camera, but it's got strip on each side, my right and left hand, and down the middle is a pieced strip. So my quilt is going to run lengthwise this way, and what I aim to do is to center my quilt so that this big stripe runs right down the middle of it, right? So the way that I did that is I just laid it out flat on the floor beforehand because it's not huge, and I put a pin in it, and it's right there, where I want the edge of this edge of my quilt to be so that it'll be centered when I get to the bottom edge, if that makes sense. So it's not terribly precise, but it will be within a ½ inch of being centered. So for eyeballing purposes, it will look great. And now you can see that piecing a little bit on the back of the quilt. And I am choosing to load it. The length of the quilt is this away. I just do that for efficiency's sake. It doesn't really matter whether the quilt is right side up or sideways as long as your quilting design is non-directional, right? So then it just comes down to efficiency. There's fewer passes when I've got the length from side to side. So that's why I'm doing it that way. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the loading. I'm just going to get it done. But I am using the red snapper system. So I've got a straight edge of fabric facing me at this front side, clipping it all into place. I do not have a selvage edge, so I am being quite careful not to put too much tension on the fabric or stretch it out. I want it to be smooth along here and not pulled, not overextended. That piece of paper I took off, by the way, said top on it. Laura is very careful to always label, and I so appreciate it. She labels which top goes with which back because she's often sending me multiple quilts, and she labels which is the top of it. And all it takes is a piece of paper pinned on that says top. So if you quilt for others, suggest that to them. It's super helpful. Okay, and the rest of my backing, I'm just tossing over the long arm rail. Going to get me 2 red snappers and walk around to the other side. So I'm just smoothing my backing over, making sure that it's not pulling to the right or pulling to the left. It's nice and smooth. Laura's seams are beautifully flat, so I'm confident this will roll up well. And I'm just watching underneath to see when the edge of my backing is approaching the edge of my leader. I should mention here too, today's episode you'll be seeing a lot of my screen as I'm working, and we'll have a lot of split screens where you can see me also. So if at all possible, try and watch this on a big screen. You'll have a hard time on your phone seeing the detail of my computer screen. So if you can cast it to your TV, that's great. Or at least watch it on the biggest monitor that you can. It will just make it more easy to see is all. Because some of the details that I'll point out on my screen are going to be, you know, the little mouse point or the little cursor, and it will be difficult to see on a small screen. Okay, there's our loaded back. Here's my batting. This is 80/20 batting. I have recently tried a new brand that I've absolutely fallen in love with, and it is called Winline, W-I-N-L-I-N-E, and that's what this is. So it is still an 80/20 cotton poly blend, and it's similar in terms of weight and loft, but it's very, very soft, and I do love it. I do love it. So that's what I've been using lately. Okay, now remember I talked about my pin. Here's my pin right here. So I'm keeping an eye on that. I want the top edge of my quilt to come to that pin. So I extended the batting a little bit beyond it. So I now cannot see the pin. I'm just trying to be conscious of it. And here again, Laura has labeled the top of the quilt, which is so helpful. And it's honestly not directional, but she just does that out of habit, and I appreciate it because there's no mistakes then. So let's watch for the pin. Let's take the paper off now. And we'll try and center it from side to side of the backing. When you are doing computerized designs, it's pretty important that you have enough excess on the left and right side for your clamps. Side clamps are critical, in my opinion. And I'm also going to take that pin out of the backing now because I don't want to sew over that inadvertently and I can't see it under the batting. Okay, it's all arranged. Mr. Producer is chuckling and saying, I've got to see some of these comments. So let me get my coffee and we'll have a look. Diane, must be chilly there today. You aren't barefoot. Have you noticed my fancy booties, Diane? It was a chilly morning, and it really is a fashion statement. Sorry about that. But yes. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few more prep things that I've done before we start stitching, and I will tell you them. Because I couldn't do it all on camera because it would just take too long. But number one is I did clean out, de-lint my machine very thoroughly and oiled it already this morning. And I put on a new needle. I don't put on a new needle for every quilt, but I have done several quilts this week on my own time. And so I thought, it's time for a fresh one. So I'm all set for being on the show. But this also is the important thing. This is what I'm using for a foot on my machine. I've got the 72S. So this will only apply if you're a Bernina user. The 72S is a ruler foot, but it's got a slit in the side. That's what the S stands for. But this will apply no matter what brand you're using. This is a spoon or cup foot, and it may look a little different on your brand, but this is really, really helpful when you're doing a digital design because you will most likely end up stitching slightly off the edge of the quilt somewhere. And if you don't want that little outside edge to catch under the foot and get stitched under as you cross over it, then a cup or a spoon foot is your friend, because it will skate over it and it will never catch that edge of your quilt. So I find that super helpful, and I always use it when I'm doing a digitized design. So in my case, my cup foot has a slit in it also, so I line those up, and that enables me to pull the thread through easily. I can't see around my camera. There we go. So that's all set to go. I'm oiled. I've got a fresh bobbin in. We're all set to go. All right, now we are going to move to the computer screen for a few moments. Mr. Producer's asking me a question. Just a second. Okay. By the way, you guys, this is live, and this is the first time that we're airing something on the Q-Matic. So there's a lot of new moving parts for us, a lot of new scenes, and even new camera angles. So bear with us as you hear us talking between ourselves, and even as I say to Mr. Producer, I want to do this next and have that scene next, so that we give you the best possible view. And we welcome your feedback about what you're seeing as well, especially when we start showing two things on the screen. Are you getting enough information? Are you seeing the things you want to see that are helpful? So let us know. We planned as best we could, but sometimes you just don't know till you have other people viewing it. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the full screen for a little bit as I get this kind of blocked into place. And I need to grab, I'm just going to buzz out of the camera for a minute. I did measure my quilt top, but I cannot now remember the numbers. So I'm going to measure it again because I need to know my quilt top measurement. Yep, I did remember correctly, but I just wanted to be sure. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to plug into my screen then is the size of my quilt. And you guys are going to see a little red kind of bullseye everywhere that I touch. Okay, so I'm looking at the arrows left and right, which show the size of my quilt. My quilt is 43 by 56 and a half. But now remember, I've got my length crossways. So I'm putting in my width as 56.5. Okay. And I'm putting in my height as 43. And that's important because if I did it the other way around, it would pick the opposite shape. Do you know what I mean? I need to get the picture of my quilt at the right shape. And I'm going to show you the whole thing so that you can see it, right? So there's that kind of landscape-oriented picture of my whole quilt. Now, keep in mind that this is just a representation of the shape of my quilt, right? Much of our trimming and placement is going to be done with the sew head, with the needle. So don't get too caught up in how this looks on the screen. Just know that we've got the correct shape and orientation of the quilt plugged in. The next thing we're going to do is make the red box, the giant red rectangle that you're seeing. That's my quilting zone. That's the area in which I have room to quilt. So this will depend on the size of the throat space of your machine, right? And depend on where you've got your quilt loaded on the rails. But this needs to be set fresh for every single quilt that you work on. Or if in fact your belts, your drive belts come disengaged, it will have to be reset too. This is what gives your computer, it's like a GPS map, a GPS location of where it is safe to quilt. So what I'm doing now is moving my machine a little bit left of the edge of my quilt because I can stitch safely off my quilt, right? So that is still a safe zone. So I'm about 1.5 inches or so to the left of my quilt. I'm at the back rail and then I pulled forward a little bit. That's as far back as I ever want it to stitch. So now I'll walk back to my screen and I'll touch my safe zone button. Oh, wrong one. Sorry about that. This is the one I want. And it asks me to move the sew head to the top left corner, which I've already done. So I walk back to my sew head, and you can't see this screen, but it's just got a set option with a little star at the top left corner. Boom, I set that. Okay, and now I will move my machine all the way to the front rail and then back up a little bit, right? As far as I want to ever have my machine stitching. And now I'm moving all the way to the lower right edge. And your machine on a different brand may have this process steps be a little different, but I guarantee you, you'll do the same thing, set this safe zone in some way. So now you see my red box has changed a little bit. You can also see really the very top edge of my quilt is not even in it. So I can zoom in on this just with my 2 fingers, right? And this is where I said, don't get too hung up on what that looks like. I'll show you how I set the machine later on to not ever attempt to stitch out of that safe area. And I'm sorry if I sound a little disjointed. These are all new words and phrases to me to be telling someone how to do this. So we've established our safe zone. Now let's go and choose our design. And let me point this out too. If you're on a Bernina, the little blue informational button in the top right-hand corner, you can toggle back and forth between having words in all the little menu choices or icons. I'm used to the icons, so that's what I use. But if you're not familiar with them yet, or if you don't remember what one is, you can always pop on those words and just toggle back and forth like that. So we're adding a design. So I've opened up my design library now is what you're seeing. And I can, in the top left-hand corner, I can match tags or search for things by name. I don't have so many designs that I'm lost in them, and I know right where the one I want to use today is. So I'm just going to head on to it. And it's this one right here, the squared BPM. So double tap on that, and you see it's put it on the right-hand side in my design center. The truth of the matter is, if I didn't know for sure what I wanted to quilt on this project yet, I could put several in my design center. I can put a skier in there. Then when I close that and go back to looking at my quilt, do you see I've got them all in the lower right there as design options? So I now could play with all of those. One of you mentioned you're working on your first Q-Matic quilt today and you're down to choosing your design. This is where I would throw a couple of them in there, do repeats in rows and see what it looks like, and let this help you choose what you want to put on your quilt. So let me show you something else. Do you see my cursor now is in the top left-hand side of the screen? I moved my machine so the cursor was there, and I only did this for one reason. It's not necessary, but when I bring a design to the quilt now, it's going to attach it to where that cursor is. So it puts it in the top left corner. If your machine is sitting somewhere away off to the edge and you pull in a design, it might end up anywhere on your screen, maybe even out of where you can see it. And you're thinking, where did it go? I'm adding it. Where did it go? And that's why. It's just tucked it somewhere on the screen because that's where your cursor is, you know, out of your view. So I just go ahead and move my cursor to that top edge and put it in. So that's one repeat of the design. Now I'm going to put in some more repeats across the top. And I'm going to put in extra because I'm probably going to make this design smaller. So let's put in a bunch. Then let's go to our sizing tool and tap on the design. And you see I've got this little green arrow. I can grab that green arrow with my finger. You guys can't see my finger, but I just placed it on the green arrow and I'm pulling it, and I can mess with the size like that. So for the moment, I'm going to choose OK, and I'm going to go back to my main screen. And now I've got this 1-to-1 ratio, which gives me life-size quilting. I use this a lot because I want to know what's it actually going to look like on my quilt. What's the actual size going to be? And I feel like this is still too widely spaced. So I'll go back to viewing my whole quilt, back to my sizing tool, and make it a little smaller again. And I'm going to do this until I'm happy with the actual size. Yep, still too big. Back to my sizing tool. And by the way, we can still add more repeats onto this, which we'll do in a moment. 1-to-1. Now I'm starting to get happier with it. I might have gone a little small there. Sizing tool. Hang on. Back to my whole quilt. Back to my sizing tool. So I'll go somewhere in between there. Let's try this one last time, 1-to-1. Yep, I'm happy with that. Okay, looking at my whole quilt. So I'm going back to my repeat button and adding a couple more repeats till it extends off the end. Safer to add more. Very easy to trim them off when you go to quilt. So I'm even going to add one more. Difficult to extend it once you've filled in a whole quilt with this design. So err on the side of plenty. And now the button next to that is going to add a row. So I add one row, and now I look at that and say, oh, but I don't want that. I don't want those empty spaces. I want it to nest. So do you see where there's spacing in inches? That's where I mess with this spacing and repeats. So I'm going to shift it to the right. I'm going to shift them closer together. And it's wise here to zoom in more. And again, I'm just zooming with my 2 fingers so that you get a really good sense of how that's fitting together. Okay, Mr. Producer was just talking to me about other design options. I don't think I'm going to go too far down that road for the sake of time today. I'll just say here, if you wanted to play with your skier or the scrap paper design that I have sitting in my design window there, this is where I would do it. I would play with them a little bit until I see what they look like with repeats and then decide if that's what I wanted to use or not. Okay, looking at this design close up now on the screen, I feel like the second one is not quite centered correctly with the top one. But look at my spacing again and notice that in the middle is a 0.25. What that means is a 1/4 inch. The design is moving a 1/4 inch at a time every time I shift it, but I can change that, and I often do. So I'm going to put it at 0.1, and now I'm going to get much smaller changes when I adjust it back and forth, right? Than that 1/4 inch. So now I'm a little happier with it, and I'm going to do the same for the up and down so that I can make more fine-tuned adjustments right there. So now I look at that and I see spacing that looks similar from one design to the next. I like how those are spaced. I'm happy with that right there. So I'm going to click green arrow for OK. And now I'm going to go back to looking at my whole quilt. Now, let's take this whole red design because it extends way above our quilt. And you see how it's not covering on the left of our quilt? And I'm picking it up with my finger because it's red and I'm just moving it around. So right about there, I'm looking at the top left corner. Is it covered on the left? Is it covered on the top? Yes, it is. I let go. Now I'm going to do my repeats again. So I'm going to add rows. Oh, and see, I have made a goof. Let's see, you guys. I should have added more rows when I was into the repeat spacing because what it's done now is it has not remembered my cool spacing. So I'm going to just do it again. I think that does it right there. It might need to be a touch closer. Let's see. 0.1. All I'm doing is making my adjustments in smaller increments now. And one more. And now I'll add rows. And I can always move. My concern is that I can see all the way to the bottom of the quilt when I know I'm getting enough rows, right? And I'm moving it with the slider. Add row, got lots of coverage. Beautiful. Now we'll accept that and let's step back and look at the whole quilt. What do we think? It certainly is well covered. Every edge is well covered. I'm happy with that. It is because it's all red or all ready or all selected. I still can grab this whole quilt literally. Do you see that? And shift it around. So if I wasn't happy with where I had placed it, I could still move it. I think I'm happy with that, so I'm letting go. Now, I want to, at this moment when it's all red, it is all one design. And it's going to try and stitch the whole quilt. And of course it can't because it's got a smaller safe area. So I am now going to unlink a bunch of these rows and then just link together the ones that I want to stitch. So I do that by pressing the unlink one time. Do you see that? And now it has turned blue. It is not red for ready anymore. But now I'll go back and set up what I do want to stitch. My difficulty now, you guys, is I got 2 rows linked together and made them one. And then I did 2 row repeats. Did you see how that happened? So I actually, because this is live and unscripted, right? I think I'm going to go back and get them back to single row repeats just because I won't be able to fit a pair of these within my safe zone. Does that make sense? A pair of the double rows? But if they were single rows, I could fit 3 of them in. So I think it's going to be more efficient to quilt if I go back to that. So because this is good practice for you guys watching too, let's just toss this design, okay, and start afresh. And I'm going to, let me see if I can light up the whole thing. Link. I'm just going to link everything together. Doesn't matter about those funky stitching lines. Link them and toss them. Let's just try again. So once again, we're at that top edge. We've put one. It's connected to where my machine is sitting, to my cursor. See if I can remember how many we had across there. I'll do one more. Size it about so. Have a look at it in real life. Little bit big. We should put one more in there. Size it tad bit smaller. Have a look at it one on one. Yep, I'm happy with that. Back to my whole quilt. Okay, so now we're back to doing repeats. This time we'll try and get our act together. So here's my row repeat plus 1, and we're going to space it now so that they're offset is the term for this. And I am going to look at it more closely because I want to make sure those lines are spaced right. So I'm just looking at the area that's kind of in the center of the screen now. And remember, I can do this spacing in tinier increments. So let's change it to 0.1 from top to bottom and also 0.1 from side to side, because now I can move it around in very small increments, and I like that. Nope, it was better where it was, right there. I think that looks really good right there. The spacing between the rows looks consistent with the spacing within the row. So I'm happy with that. So now I need to add my rows right here so that I can see them singly. See how it's adding one at a time? That's what I was going for. And I'm just zooming out far enough that I can see my whole quilt and make sure I have enough rows and plenty to spare. I'm even going to add one more just in case. Super easy to trim off, as I mentioned earlier. So I'll accept that. Again, my whole quilt is red now, so I'm going to put my finger on the screen and grab the quilt, and I can shuffle it around until I'm happy in that top left corner with the top edge being fully covered and the left edge being fully covered. Great. I'll let go. Now I'm going to unlink those rows, and then each row will be separate. And by the way, if you press unlink several times, like this, you'll start getting smaller and smaller unlinkages. But the two little arrows here that do an undo or a redo are a great help when something like that happens. So we've got single rows now. We've got, you notice, there is a green start button on the left-hand side of every row, and there's a red stop on the right-hand side or end point of every row. This too we can mess with to make it efficient in quilting, because we want to, let's just look at the whole quilt. We want to be able to zigzag our rows. So first row left to right, the second row it'll just continue at that right edge and work back toward the left, and so forth and so on. So what we're going to do is shift the beginning and ending points of the rows. So I'm going to do every second row. So I'll touch the second row, and I'll touch the white and black dots. Let me put the info on for you. See the reverse sew, second down from the right? Okay, now I'll put the icon back on. And I'm just going to do that on every second row. So now my starting point alternates, left, right, and so forth. Just like that. Okay, I think we're ready to start trimming to begin sewing. So now we're going to go back to our split screen, and we'll start to see things in action. Are we ready? Good deal. I think, honestly, I think that's a fine view, Dave. Did you guys notice there's a nice little breaking wave happening behind this picture? That's so you're like get in the mood for the cruise. It's all restful and holiday-ish. Okay. Yeah, you guys, this is like a preview of the cruise. This is like a little appetizer, a little amuse-bouche, pulling out my French again. Okay, what we want to do now is choose the quilting design that we're going to quilt, the full space that we're going to quilt. So we're going to connect the rows that we want to quilt this first pass. So I've got the top row, I've just touched it and made it red for ready, okay? Now I'm going to hit the link button and the little link bullet, and I'm going to link number 2 and link number 3, And now I need to decide, can I also link number 4 and get it in there before, do you see the big red bar? That's my safe zone, right? That's as far as I can stitch. And I think, yes, look at that. I can get that 4th one in this time. So I'm going to choose yes to accept that. Now don't get upset over the wonky stitch lines that you're seeing on the edges. We're going to trim, and that's going to get fixed here in half a second. So that's the area we're going to be quilting, or that's the repeats that we're going to be quilting. And now we're going to give our quilt some more specific areas. So I'm walking back over to the long arm machine, and what I'm going to do next is basting, which is the same whether you're working on a digital design or not. This is always, in my point of view, absolutely critical. Mr. Producer's trying to tell me something. Okay, so a couple of things. Wanted to remind you, if you're just tuning in, to be watching on the biggest possible screen that you can so you can see some of these details. And also, I suspect that there are some of you in the audience that are more skilled at this than I am. I acknowledge I am still a beginner to this, and there's probably, I know there's things I can do in different ways, and there's possibly even much better ways. So I appreciate your comments. I'll do my best to even get back and read them. So I'm just being really honest here. This is me. This is where I am in my learning process. And over time, I'm sure I will learn more tips about this too. So bear with me if you're further along in that learning process. And I would love to learn from you too. I'm just the one out there silly enough to be doing it on live camera. That's all. So I do, by the way, have my channel locks or my belts engaged so that I'm getting very straight perimeter edges on my basting. I don't always do that on every quilt, but I certainly want to on this one because I want, my long arm's name is Stella. I want Stella to know exactly where I am at all times and to know exactly where the perimeter is, so I must have perfectly straight edges and 90-degree corners in order for her to know what's what. And if you are using a Bernina machine too, we have an easy glide feature, which when I go fast enough, you can see that it kind of grabs and starts driving like that smoothly and quickly. It's almost too fast for me to control the basting, but that is certainly an option. So even when the belts are engaged, that easy glide helps you to move smoothly and without a lot of resistance. And that's a cool Bernina feature. And you can see as I'm stitching, maybe you can't. No, you've got a longer away view. I'll just tell you. Laura is kind enough to do what we quilters call the victory lap around the perimeter of all her quilts. So all these little seams at the side, she's got a row of stay stitching around the whole outer edge of the quilt, so they all stay in place and they don't pull open. Really, really helpful. Okay, I've got my edge basted. And then one other thing that I think is really critical when you're working with digital designs, when the computer's going to be driving, and that is that you do have side clips on that keep even tension on the quilt from side to side. It's absolutely critical that the quilt cannot pull in because you're going to be lining up your repeats. The next row you want to line up and match up with the repeats of the first row. This design that we're quilting is not super, super precise or small or intricate. So it's not, you know, an 1/8 of an inch is not going to be a big deal, but there are some designs where it really, really matters. And this is one of the ways that you head off any problems with that, is you have the entire perimeter of your quilt is secured in place. So we've basted, we've put side clamps on, and I'm going to put my magnetic bars on the front. You know, maybe you have C-clamps that fit over the front of your machine. Perhaps you even want to put a basting row on the front edge of the quilt. But in some way, you need all the sides of the quilt to be secure so that you can't have any shifting going on. And this too is key. We're about to go and start trimming the design to fit the quilt. And it is critical that you don't move anything after you've told it where to trim. So for example, I must have those side clamps on first, because if I tell it to trim at a certain spot and then I put the side clamp on and that moves 1/8 of an inch, that's a problem. If I tighten my ratchets of my rails 1 notch, that's going to mess up that lining up, right? So all the securing has got to be done first before you tell the machine, here's where I am and here's where I want you to stitch. Make sense? So now we've got everything secured and in place. We're not going to move another muscle, so to speak. I'm setting my machine now where my needle is lined up with the right edge of where I want to quilt, to stitch. So for me, I've basted within 1/4 inch, so it's going to fall within that bound edge. So I also ideally want this stitching to fall within that 1/4 edge. I don't love stitching way off it. Some people do with digital designs and then just trim it up. I don't love cutting all those threads. I feel like that weakens a bit the security of those quilted stitches. So I try as much as I can to line up my stitching so that it ends within that basted edge. And then the machine will just go back into the design and never stitch way off the side. So I've lined up my needle with that area. And now you're going to see how really nifty easy this is to trim. I pick my little scissors trimming tool, okay? And I like to trim using my sew head. But I do have the option. You can see the control screen at the top. I'm toggling between screen and sew head. So if I do it on the screen, I can literally choose on my computer screen where I want that trim line to be. But for me, there's safety in doing it at my sew head because now it's going to trim where my needle is. I'm not relying on that translation to picture. So remember earlier I said don't get too hung up about where the rectangle of the quilt is. That is only true if you're going to do your trimming with your needle for placement. So I always trim at the sew head. Those of you who have done this lots might have more opinions about this or how it's done, but this is what has worked for me to be reliable and foolproof. Trim at the sew head, so I've clicked on that. For method, I've got selected design. I don't yet want to do the entire quilt because what if my quilt is 1/4 inch wider at the bottom and I've trimmed that already and I don't get my stitching out as far as I want it. So I choose to trim as I go down each pass. And then trim line orientation, well, I'm going to be doing vertical because I'm marking where my right hand edge is. Okay, so now on my sew head, and you guys can't see this, but on my sew head is where my set button is. So I've got my needle in place, I push set, and what happens on my computer screen now, did you see that happen? The outer edge turned black. And what's black is what is going to trim away. So here's a fun little feature. I'm sure there's a method for this on every digital program, but on Bernina, it's just called invert. If I click invert, it trims the opposite thing. So I've established a trim line, and I can either make this side or this side trim away. And if you can't remember which one it is, it doesn't matter. You can just push invert until the black is on the part that you want to be gone. And then you press green for OK, and it's trimmed right off, just like that. Now we're going to do the same thing for the top edge. So again, I'm lining up my needle with that top edge where I want the stitching to end, and it's just outside my basting line and just inside the edge of my quilt. I know that top edge is perfectly straight, so the same line will hold through all the way across. So I click trim, sew head, horizontal this time I'll leave on, and I know I want to invert it. At my sew head, I push set, and you can see the top is trimming black. And here again, you see that my initial black outline picture of my quilt, it's not quilting to the edge of that. All that means is I probably typed in my picture slightly bigger than the quilt actually is. But for me, the safety is in I've lined up my needle. I know where it's going to stitch if I do that trimming at the sew head. So I'm not too worried about where that black picture is. I'm worried about where my needle is. That's where it's going to stitch. Trust the sew head, in my opinion. One of you who's experienced can tell me this one because I actually don't know the answer. In the top right-hand corner, you see a little tiny stitch line. And what it's doing is it's stitching a design and it's ending up in the top corner and it needs to get to another part to start the next stitching area. It's going to stitch that line. I know there's a way to tell it not to do that, and I don't know what it is. So my solution today is going to be to come back and undo that afterwards. It's going to be about this long, a stitching line that I have to undo. I know there's a solution. I just don't know what it is. Forgive me. Now I'm just moving all the way to the left, and we're going to mark the left stitching boundary, trim, sew head again, vertical again, and just to show you, I will not invert it. I will just push set. And look how my main quilting area turned black. Well, I know I don't want that, so I'll push invert again. And now it's trimming on the outside perimeter. That's what I want. Trim, and we're good to go. So let's look at our whole quilt again. And now you're kind of getting the big picture. What's in red is what's ready, what we're going to stitch. It's all within the safe zone. If I did not have it within the safe zone, if I had picked one too many rows and it extended even 1/8 of an inch beyond what I told it was the safe zone, it would start giving me an error message when I want to quilt. It would say, you're outside the safe zone, can't stitch it. And so then you'd start looking for that, but you can see your red box. You know, if you zoom in, you can see if it has extended beyond that area or not. Mine has not, so I think it's ready to go. So now I'm going to push the start arrow, and now I'm getting an error message in this way. There are queued designs outside the safe area. It's asking me DQ and proceed. So what's happened is I've still got my whole quilt queued up. In other words, quilt this first, then that first, then that first. And this queuing process is really important if you're doing more custom quilting and you want to quilt this thing first and then that thing second and then that thing third. You can program or queue that all in place first. On my edge to edge, I just want my box that I'm working on now is going to be the only thing in my queue. So I can either go through the process of dequeuing everything, queuing up my one pass and starting, or right here, it asks me, do you want to DQ and proceed? And all I'm doing is saying, I don't want to quilt the whole thing yet. I just want to quilt this. So I can just choose yes here, and I'm good to go. And at this point, I'm going to start quilting at the start point of the design. And we're ready. So thread-wise, because it's going to think a few minutes and get it orientated and ready to stitch while it's thinking, thread-wise, I've got a slightly cream-colored, tanny-colored thread loaded, both top and bottom. It's 40 weight isocord, 100% polyester thread. I chose this thread because you can see multicolored quilt, and the light colors in the hourglass shapes, they're not white, they're cream, but very, very light. And of course, the rich jewel tone colors in the quilt, high contrast going on. It's always a conundrum what thread to choose in that case. A lot of quilters will say, choose the lightest color in your quilt and use that thread. I don't love the lightest color because it's really high contrast on the dark fabrics. So my kind of mid-level solution was choose a cream colored thread, but go darker than what's in the hourglass shapes. So it's 3 or 4 shades darker. It's a rich tan. And so it will not be super high contrast on that white, and it just lessens the contrast a little bit on the darks. That's my method. Middle of the road. Okay, now on my sew head, I'm getting the option of a single stitch down or a bobbin stitch to pull a bobbin thread up, and that's what I'm going to choose. So it's going to take 1 stitch. I'm hanging on to the top thread. We'll take 1 stitch. We're not going to move the machine at all to grab that thread. So I'm just going to swoop underneath with my long top thread, and now I've got both of them held in my hands. And now I simply push the start button. So it's going to take a couple of closely spaced stitches, and then it's going to be up and away. And I'm pausing it for half a second. I'm looking down, and I'm seeing my thread wobble a little bit more than it should. I'm used to what it ought to look like, and I see it's actually come out of one thread guide, or I didn't have it in correctly. So I just paused for a second, put it in that thread guide, and resume. And on we go. So do we want to put, Mr. Producer, do you want to put a close-up shot of that? and we'll chat for a few minutes. So while, could be a close-up shot and me, or just me. That'll be fine too. While it's stitching, we'll chat for a few minutes, and I'll tell you a couple more things about the quilt and my design choice for it. You know, choosing a design, I always say there is not just one right design, but there are better designs than others for sure. Sometimes with quilts that have only straight lines in it, I like to do something curvy and swirly, and that would have been absolutely fine for this one. But this particular design that I'm stitching out, as you saw on the computer screen, is all these kind of echoing squares, and it's all 45-degree angles. It's a really pleasing design and quilts out quickly. Laura's piecing is always beautiful and accurate, and it has those same 45-degree angles in it. So I opted to use this one because I think it will kind of play up those 45-degree angles. And what you guys don't know is that I've got 3 more quilt tops that look just like this. So I have the fun of doing one thing on one quilt and one thing on another and something different on the other one, right? So this one's going to have the 45-degree angles played up. Another one might have something swirly on it. So Laura's such a sweetie. She lets me experiment a little bit and play with her quilts a little bit. She does these quilts for various charitable organizations, sometimes hospices, sometimes an Alzheimer care location, sometimes cancer patients, and she makes a lot of these scrappy lap quilts, and it is my pleasure to quilt them for her. Okay, do we have any questions, Mr. Producer, that we want to talk about? Okay, oh, he's working on some wires and stuff, so we better keep chatting a little longer. Something else that I can set on my machine, and I'm sure you can on whatever digital program you're using too, is the speed at which the machine is stitching. Now, I've got mine close to the top end because why not? Let's get it done more quickly. But know that whatever speed you set it at, it will never exceed what it can safely or with quality stitch that particular design. So designs that are more fiddly or that have more corners, right, where it's got to stop and pause and figure out that corner, are going to take longer because the machine will slow down in order to get accurate stitch lengths. It can't zoom into the corner and stop on a dime and zoom back out. It will slow down for those intricate designs. So I'm drawn, because this is my style, I'm drawn toward the designs that are more flowing and that just keep going quite smoothly. This one, even though it has quite a few corners, they're ever so slightly rounded so that it keeps up a pretty good pace throughout. So this to me is a winning edge-to-edge design because it quilts out very smoothly and quite quickly. I tried not too long ago, I was doing a Christmassy quilt, and I found a digital design that was all pine trees, like rows of pine trees, and it was directional, like they all faced the same direction, and so was my quilt. So I thought, perfect, what a great design. So I lined it up in repeats and I started stitching it, and I think I did one tree, and I thought, yeah, no, I'm never doing that again. It had so many corners in the tree and it took so long to do one tree. I thought, I'll be here all year doing this whole quilt. Okay, so just my voice now. Great. You guys are happy just hearing my voice, aren't you? Anyway, you can see the stitching now and see what you think of that thread that I chose. I'm happy with that. Even in these pieced blocks, there's kind of a mixture of lighter and darker fabric, so it blends quite nicely. And it's not too terribly dark on the lighter areas of the quilt, so I'm happy with that. Something else that you might explore, whatever program you're using, is your ability to save designs. So I have found a couple designs that I really like and use frequently. And what I've actually done is save them as though they were a quilt in basically a giant king-sized picture. And so, but I've got it figured out, like the sizing, the spacing of the design in a really pleasing way. So they're more complex ones than this one. And then what happens is I can just pull up that saved file and drop it over top of any quilt, even this small one, and trim the edges to fit. So it's a way to save time, to not have to redo those individual repeats, build them up into rows, build the rows up, offset them. All of that is a bit of a process. So If you're able to save a design, that's one way to save yourself a bunch of time, is save it really big and then just lay it over top of whatever quilt size you're using and trim it down to size. And I should do that with this one because this is a favorite and I really like it in the approximately 1-inch spacing. It's just a very pleasant kind of all-purpose size for a lap quilt. I really, really like this design. Okay, so Mr. Producer is working on views and where he's going to tuck the different camera views so that I can see the questions and you guys can see them too. Meantime, Stella is just happily stitching away. So it's a good opportunity to type in any questions if you have them. Be gentle if you're typing in schooling instructions for me. Keep in mind, this is newer to me. I do not have a ton of experience doing edge-to-edge digital designs yet, but I'm growing in my experience. But meantime, people have been asking, so I thought, well, I'll share what I do know, and hopefully it will help someone who's beginner level. And as I learn more, I'll share more. But I am happy to take any tips that you have to offer. How close are we to comments? Okay, we're going to be on this camera. Mr. Producer is doing a juggling act today. Okay, Sharon, I had a quilt on my long arm yesterday and ran out of backing. What would you do in that situation to fix it? If I loaded my quilt, sewed an extra piece on, reloaded on long arm, and finished it. Oh, if I unloaded my quilt. I do have an episode, Sharon, and it's, oh, I changed quilts behind me. It was a filaments design, and it was a Christmassy quilt in which that happened to me in a live and unscripted episode. I got to the bottom edge and I had run out of fabric. And I talked about a couple different ways to finish it. What I ended up doing is exactly what you described. I unloaded my quilt and I had about 3 inches of excess fabric at the top. So I trimmed that off because I was able to load that finished quilted edge. I just pinned onto my leader. So I salvaged all those 3 inches of fabric, put them on the bottom edge, reloaded it, and I was only short about 1 inch. So it was enough. Reloaded it and quilted that bottom edge, and that worked great. Sometimes, depending on the directionality of your quilt, you might have enough fabric on the side that you could use. Sometimes, if you're only short a little bit and it's being used up in your loading apparatus, sometimes you can just actually sew a leader on the end of some other fabric just so you can use every little 1/4 inch of your real backing fabric, and sometimes that's enough. But in most cases, it's going to involve unloading and reloading it just because you've got to be able to sew that backing fabric on. I think it's probably possible to sew a piece of backing fabric on while it's on the long arm, but is it as easy? I don't know. I doubt it. If you have zippered leaders, you can always sometimes take the top edge off that way, depending on whether or not you're cutting that top edge. Long answer for a short question, but there are definitely ways to do that, Sharon. Hope that was helpful. Okay, another question. Marion, will you talk about the tape measure you put near the roller near you? Absolutely, Marion. I've got a dead bar or leveler bar at the back of my quilting machine. So my quilt goes under that and then rolls up on the take-up bar. And I took a long armer's tape measure and I just took 3M double-sided tape and I stuck pieces and I affixed that tape all the way along, and it's staying beautifully. It gives me a guideline for the edges of my quilt, and it is really useful when I'm doing digital work because as you're quilting, it wants to pull in just a little bit. So having those visible guides that I can see. You know, this quilt ends at 23 inches on this side, whatever the number is on the other side. When I go to advance it, I can see those numbers and line it up. I can massage my quilt roll if I need to. I can tug on the edges if I need to till I get it back to that measurement. And it just helps to keep things square as I'm progressing. Okay, more questions? Sue, how does the Winline batting hold up to washing? So I have not yet used it over a period of years, but I do know that Winline has been in business for about 18 years. So it's long standing. It's had time to wash and for people to use it and wear it to its nth degree. I do know this. I met Luann as the owner, and I met her at the Houston Quilt Show. And she had a sample there that was done with her bamboo batting. And it was just a little quilt, and it was made of quilting cotton, and it had been washed so much that the fabric was breaking down, as cotton does, like at the seams. It was just getting paper thin and holes where you could actually see the batting through. So cotton fabric was breaking down. The batting was still fully intact and had not, bunched or pieced or shredded in any way. That was her bamboo, and it was really holding up well. I bet she has samples of the 80-20 as well, but I don't personally. So it does have a scrim, so that helps too with its durability. So I know that's in place. Okay, go ahead. Sandra, why didn't it remember when you added the third roll? And I'm guessing you remember the third repeat, Sandra. It's because I had put two together and linked them and then exited out. And then when I came back, it recognized those two as a single unit, and it added those units, which in some designs might be helpful. It might speed up the process. But in my case, I wanted to be able to address each row as a single unit, so it wasn't helpful for me. I'm sure there's lots in that area that I have not experimented with yet and tips behind that, but that's as much as I know. Stella's getting right in front of me now. Gail, do you always baste going up on the side? I do, Gail. I know there are others who recommend, center to left, center to right, and starting at the bottom and basting upwards. I just do what's most efficient, which is up one side, across, and down the other side. But I do it knowing going in that I understand how to get my quilt to not shift around on me, right? If I've got a quilt that's got any issues, I drop pins so my quilt can't shift around on me. Or if there's any fullness that's got to be taken in, I pre-plan that, drop some pins in there. That would be the reason for basting in a different order, is so that your fabric's not pushing away and getting out of square, right? So I'm confident I can keep it in square, so that's how I choose to do it. And look, we're at the end. Were there more questions before we go on to the next thing? Okay, let's do a few more questions and then we'll go and do an advance. Okay, Mr. Producer's talking in my ear. He says, go ahead and do the advance and we'll come back to questions, and I agree with that. So can we do a close-up shot for just a second? Let's see if we can get that in the screen, because I want to point out to you guys this very edge. I'll undo some clamps while he does that. He can do anything, he says, and that's pretty much true. Okay, we're on the head cam. No, we're not seeing my live camera, though. We're seeing a picture. There's no quilt on there. I'll take the magnets off while he's looking. Okay, you can see where I've ended. My needle is still down. It has ended with a couple lock stitches again. So my preference is always to put a new bobbin in or anything that I need to do at this edge, because it's been so well secured and I love that. But I also wanted to point out, do you see how my stitching, can you see it down here? It ended right within the parameters I wanted, outside the basting line, inside the edge of the quilt. Perfect. I'm so happy with that. So now I'm just pulling up my bobbin thread, and I don't have to move my machine to do it. That's just so habitual for me. I do move it away after I pull it up so that I've got a tail of bobbin thread underneath, but now I've got my bobbin and my top thread right here. You can see them all, and I'll clip them, and now there's no tail underneath. Beautiful. And now we're going to advance the quilt. So I will move Stella off and out of the way. I've got my clamps all off, my magnets from the front, my clamps from the side. You do not need to mark sort of the GPS location before you roll. You're going to do all that afterwards. So I'm rolling and I'm eyeballing where I know how close I can stitch to that top rail. And I'm going to move Stella and just double check if this was an intricate design or a lot of quilting. I might want to know. I want to be sure that I'm going to be able to quilt within my safe zone far enough to get the top edge of that next repeat. That all looks good. I am visually, what camera will, yeah, perfect. I'm looking at my tape measure now that is on my top rail, right? And I'm checking that my left edge is at the number 23, which is where I began. So it's still nice and straight here. And for, I think it was Gail who asked about the basting. This edge along the left here is just a little bit ripply, a little bit lettucey. So I'm just watching that. It's not so much that it's going to be a problem, but I'm making sure that my seam running along is parallel to my front rail and is not bowing down at the side, right? I don't want to smooth that down and then my seam is angling downward and I'm going to have a crooked quilt. So I want to be sure that seam is straight all the way across. I'm going to know I've got to get that little teeny tiny bit of excess in there. And now I'm going to baste this left side. Again, I'm just pulling up my bobbin thread, hanging on to both while I stitch. And remember, my belts are engaged, so I am definitely getting a perfectly straight line, no doubt about it. And my gentle tugging of what's already been stitched is pulling the front fabric that has not yet been stitched under the needle just a touch faster, and that's how I'm pulling in that little bit of easing that needed to be done. And then I'll pan back over it and you can see it's evenly eased in. There's no pleats anywhere. There's no significant gathers. Can you see that? Just, well, they can see it in the big picture too. It's honestly fine, Mr. Producer, sir. Oh, there we go. I'll pan over that so you can see again. So here's where my basting ended, way down here. And there's a little bit eased. You can hardly even see it. There's so little of it. But spreading it in evenly like that takes care of it beautifully. While I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and put my left clamp on. This clamp is also from the Red Snapper system. I think they're called Red E-Edge clamps. I do love them. Today it's a little bit of a challenge because I have a seam that I've got to get in that little teeny tiny channel. Come on. There we go. So that's all in place. I'm taking one last look at my number 23 over there. That looks lined up great. When I am doing digital designs, I do tend to check my bobbin level at the end of a pass. So that first, several rows that we did, I call that one pass, right? I want to check my bobbin level because I don't love when my bobbin runs out in the middle of a digital design. I'm moving it over just a touch. I prefer to change out the bobbin then before I do another design if I think it won't do a whole pass or at least a whole row so that I can change it out when the stitching is in that basted edge. Does that make sense? That's just my personal preference. And then I use those bobbins up, those bits, for other things. Sometimes I use them as top threads in my sewing machine. Sometimes when I'm doing freehand quilting and it's easier to determine where I want, the bobbin stitching to end, I'll use up those bits and bobs that way too. Don't want to waste the thread, but also it can be a bit of a nuisance to change in the middle. Nevertheless, on the last pass, because I promised you guys in the description that I would show you that, I will stop in the middle and show you how to switch out bobbin thread. Okay, we've got the sides basted. Our seam on the front looks nice and straight. Our edges line up where they should to keep the quilt square and flat. I'm putting my magnets on the front. And now everything is secure and I'm not going to move anything else. And now we're going to start lining up our repeat of pattern. I like to do this from the middle of the quilt, approximately the middle. Again, those of you who have done this a long time might have an opinion about this. But sometimes, especially when you're on a large quilt, sometimes there is a little bit of shift, and no matter how hard you work, there's still a tiny bit of difference in how the pattern lines up. There's a little bit of pullage. And so if I line it up perfectly at one side, all that offness, if it's a 1/4 inch, is going to be at the other side. If I line up in the middle, it's going to be off a tiny, tiny bit at each edge. And I know that the more experienced quilters know how to make that line up precisely. I've chosen to just not do designs that are that incredibly precise, but it still helps, I feel like, to do my navigating from the center of the quilt, and then whatever problems I have will at least be evenly dispersed. Does that all make sense? That's the novice in me talking. So what I'm doing is I'm picking a point, a recognizable point on what I previously quilted, which happens to be the bottom of one of these diamonds. I don't actually have a laser pointer on my machine. If you do, it's really helpful right here. I'm just pulling off my spoon foot so I can see better, and I'm dropping my needle to make sure I'm right on that point. And here's another handy trick, and you might not have known about this one. I'm not sure. Lower left on my screen, there's a little kind of four-way arrow. We're going to make sure you can see the bottom edge of the screen, yeah? Okay, you'll see it when I touch it. Yep, with the little red bullseye. This brings on my sew head something called a micro move. And now I can move my machine in tiny, tiny, tiny increments. And I learned this from another quilter. What are you trying to change? So they didn't see the button that I pressed?
They saw the button. I was on the wrong.
Oh, okay. So I'll move this so you guys can see the machine moving. Can you see that it's moving in tiny, tiny, tiny increments? They're little. So what's happening, and I did learn this from another quilter, if I'm a fraction, like a 1/16 of an inch off my point that I'm trying to hit, and I'm joggling my machine, it's not really reading that accurately from the belts. Much better to get close to my point and then use this little micro adjustment to get to the actual point where I want to be. So I have learned to do that. That made good sense to me, and I have learned to do that. So I'm just adjusting with those micro moves until my needle is spot on my trusty little point that I want to hit. And I'm struggling with it, I'll be honest. There it is. Okay. Turn the micro move off, put my hopper foot back on, my spoon foot. And it just snaps on, by the way. If you're a Bernina owner, it just snaps on to the either ruler foot or the 72S. Okay, so now we're not going to budge the machine at all. We're going to go back to our main computer. And by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier. I'm doing everything as a touchscreen with my fingers, but you certainly can use a keyboard and mouse to do all these things too. That option is available. So I'm going to reposition my safe zone. Okay, we're waiting just a moment. What's happening? Okay, I'll just do that again in case you didn't see it. So I'm picking my resetting the safe zone, and I'm going to drop a guideline, which is the set button at the top. That drops a red line right where my cursor is on the quilt. Now I can use my two fingers and zoom way in, and this bottom point is what I want to set. That what's grayed out there has already been quilted, and I want to line up my stitching with that bottom point. I can zoom in as much as I want. I cannot drag my little bullseye, but I can redo it as many times as I need until I'm happy with where it is. Well, that's pretty funny. Good thing this is not a precise design. Let's zoom in a little more. We'll move it up. We'll zoom in. We'll get a nice big bullseye. There we go. Happy with that. Look back at our whole quilt. No, I did something wrong. I must not have pressed OK. Let's do it again. There we go. I must not have pressed the green arrow. Huh. Okay, you guys. Who's the expert here, and why is this not repositioning for me? I'm clearly doing something wrong. I guarantee you it's user error, but what is it? Oh, snap to point. That's what I've got to do. See, I'm on air and I'm not remembering that. Snap to point. There we go. Now, I'm looking at my whole quilt again, and you can see that my red box has moved down. So what's grayed out is already fully stitched. What's in the red box is what we're going to stitch next. So we're going to link together the designs that we're going to stitch. Red is ready, so I click on that top row to make it red. I click on link and the link little button, and I link one more, and I can certainly link a third. Perfect. Okay, those are all linked together. And now we can trim them, ready to go. I'm looking at the side here where my start arrow is, and it is in fact on the left. You can see that. And the truth of the matter is, it could be on the right. My first row could be on the right, and that would be fine. But since it's on the left, I'm going to pull Stella over and trim the right side first, trim the left side second, and then I'll be right there near my start point. Start point. Trim, sew head, selected design, vertical. And now on my sew head, I'm pushing set. I've got my needle oriented where I want that edge to be. The right-hand edge turned black, as you can see, and I trim it right off. Moving all the way to the left. Again, very carefully, not moving anything on my quilt, not rolling up or ratcheting up any rollers, anything like that, not even leaning on the rail. Moving my needle to where I want that left stitching line to be, trim, sew head, selected design, vertical, and I do want invert for the left side. I push set on the sew head screen, and you can see it turn black. Again, if you're watching this on a tiny screen, find yourself a bigger one so you can see these details. And we're good to go. So a quick double check. All the stitching is within my red box, right? My beginning green arrow is on the left there where my sew head already is. The truth of it is, it will automatically find the starting point. The machine will just move to it, so I wouldn't have to be on the same side. And I get my same error message that I had the first time. There are queued designs outside the safe area. DQ and proceed. Yes, all I'm doing is DQing that whole very lower edge of the quilt. And I'm going to start stitching at the start point, and we're going to be ready to go. Then there will just be one more pass, and on that one, actually, well, two things here. I'll finish my sentence first. On the last pass, I am going to do a thread break in the middle of it, just so you can see that. I've got my thread tail caught in the clamp. I did not actually ever check my bobbin. I'm pretty confident I can do a whole nother pass, but just to be on the safe side, I won't move the machine at all because it's lined up for the start point. I'm looking at my bobbin. It has plenty of thread to do a whole nother pass. I am trying really hard to put it back in underneath where I cannot see. Snap, it's in, close the door, we're ready to go. Okay, grab that top thread and hang on to it. Do the bobbin pull up, one stitch. Grab the bobbin thread and hang on to it, and hang on to both in my left hand. Hang on for the ride. Now, I always, because I am still inexperienced at this, I always stand and watch the first little bit and make sure that it is lining up appropriately with what came before. Because if it's not lined up properly, you'll soon see it. And you can stop before it's done a whole ton of quilting incorrectly. Lovely. We're good to go. Okay. Shall we get back to more questions and more coffee? So I'm going to zoom in my screen a little more. And can you see that the cursor is actually moving around where the stitching is happening? I've made that bigger just so you can see it. I'm just going to try and fit the whole quilt in there so you can watch that progress. There, it's all in. Okay. This is very marvelous. You can like walk over to your sewing machine and stitch a binding onto a different quilt or answer an email, whatever you need to do. I'm sorry? Okay, Sue, I missed where the button for those micro movements is. Can you show it again, please? Yes, remind me, Sue, and I'll show it again near the end, but it is in the lower left, and it's actually a button that's got two different functions on it. The bottom function has these 4 kind of arrows, and it's the micro movements, but I will show you that again because it is really, really helpful. When I show you the broken thread, I'll probably use it again then too. It just is helpful for those tiny, tiny movements, and you know that the machine has got pinpoint placement. If you're jerking the machine a little bit, you're not positive that the belts are reading that teeny, tiny movement, right? Where when you do micro movements, it's got it right in its head, and that's perfect. Okay, another question? Where is the name of our ETE and where's it's from? Oh, this ETE. You know, I knew this question would come, and so I went and looked it up, and it's called Square. I don't know the designer name, so I'm going to have to search back for that. This is something maybe you more experienced Bernina owners will know the answer to this. I don't see in my design library that it brings in the designer's name when I import a design. And I would really like to have that because I would like, you know, if I post on social media or whatever, I'd like to give that person credit. And also I'm finding that over time, I'm getting to know the designers that have well thought through and easily stitched designs. And then there are some that they just don't work as smoothly. They don't always line up or meet quite as nicely. So there's just designers I prefer. I would like to know who they are, right? Because it's easy to find their designs then and make that connection. So I'll try and find out for you who it is, but it is called Square. Oh, pardon me. Squared with a period at the end. Squared. And it is a really, really nice design. I think I purchased it from thepantoshop.com, which is a newer digital design shop. It's 3 ladies that work together. And I'm pretty sure that's where I got it. And the designer may be Leisha K, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So I'll try and find that out for you. Okay, more questions? Okay, this is a twofer. Let's see if we can get it all. Linda, where did you get your side clamps? Okay. And new to long arming, curious about your tension thingy on the left and right sides of the quilt. Okay, easy answer. Mr. Producer says he loves that you call it a thingy because that's his very descriptive word too. Let me set my coffee down. Okay, these side clamps, they're made by the Red Snapper brand. So that's the same loading apparatus that I use at the top and bottom of the quilt. And you can get them from 2 places. One is quiltsonthecorner.com. The lady, Renee, who owns that shop, is the maker and designer of the Red Snapper system. And she has these clamps. And also, I have often been able to find them on Amazon because sometimes different, like they come in different sizes, and sometimes the shop will have them and sometimes Amazon will have them. Anyway, they're still the Red Snapper brand. So if you Google Red Snapper clamp, you'll find them. I'm pretty sure I have this in my description below this episode. I've got Red Snapper clamps there, and that will take you to their things on Amazon. So I've got the 16-inch clamps on mine. They also come in 19 and 12. So what's lovely about them is that they put even tension on the whole side. So get the biggest one that will fit comfortably in your throat space. And secondly, they're very slim top to bottom. And I like that. Like I can actually slide my machine and hopper foot out right over them. They're that slim. And I like that about them too. So that's my clamps. Red Snapper. Lauren, does the windline batting change the texture of the finished quilt since it is softer? Is it floppier or sturdier? It's a very small difference, Lauren. I don't know that you could tell the difference by, you know, flexing the quilt. It's just a little bit softer, like actually to the touch. I like working with it. It's a similar price to Hobbs, so, you know, either one certainly fits the bill. I really fell in love with Windline's bamboo. So that's kind of got me sold on that line right now. The bamboo is just amazing. Amazing, the feel of that in a quilt. Okay, Juliana, could you have dropped in one skier every now and then in the design? I don't think so, Juliana. I think you could do that if you were doing blocks or areas. But when you're talking an edge-to-edge design, what happens is in this square design, it's actually a fairly good example because it's one square. And when I add, I get a row of squares. But what's important is that the beginning stitch and the ending stitch exactly line up. So when I put the next beginning to it, it matches the previous ending. So skier, skier, skier might work, but block, skier is not likely going to have a matching beginning and ending point. Does that make sense? So it's not, you couldn't easily fill a whole quilt and have them stitch out continuously. You could drop in a block, a skier, but you couldn't stitch rows of blocks and skiers. They wouldn't line up. Having said that, Bernina does have Art and Stitch built into their program, which is the design program. So you can take things into that design program and mess around with where those lines meet, and possibly you could make designs connect. I am no expert in that. I just know that possibility is out there. And then you can create a stitching line out of it and bring it back into your stitching program, and away you go. But I don't know how to do that personally. So find someone else who can help you with it. Okay, more questions? Sherry, the designer of Squared is Leisha Farnsworth. There you go. I was right. Thank you for that. So she is Leisha K on most social media, but Leisha Farnsworth is her name. And she has a ton of great designs. She's a long arm quilter, and her stuff always works. So I highly recommend her designs. Good. I'm glad I remembered that correctly. Judy, do you have an optimized area on the screen to be able to remove breaks? If so, I don't know about it, Judy. I think that I have to take my design over into Art and Stitch if I want to tweak things, but I'm not positive about that within the design area. Truly, my experience still is about this big. I know that. I know that to be true. And I really only know edge to edge too. So if it's there, I just don't know it. I'm sorry. Lorraine, know what the difference is between an astronaut operating in a space shuttle and a long armor? Marico Spains, you're hysterical. Okay, Diane. I usually avoid touching the bar of the quilt while the robot is quilting, lest I shift something. You know, you're right, Diane, and I'm not putting any weight on it, but it's probably wisdom to just not touch it at all, because you're exactly right. The slightest shift will make it stitch wonky. I know this for sure because when I go to quilt shows, we usually have more than one long arm set up, and one is usually computerized in stitching a design. And more people come up and talk, and they do the whole and lean on the long arm. Sometimes it's 300-pound guys leaning on the long arm, and the stitching is so funny. So yes, it's wisdom to just not touch it. Okay. Sue, for the thread guide above the needle, I learned from my dealer to thread through the hole instead of the open area so the thread can't slip out of that guide. That's actually a good tip, Sue. So very early on when I was stitching the first pass, I just began stitching. If you weren't here then, I saw that the thread had popped out of a thread guide, which is just a groove, but there's also an actual hole there, so you can thread it through that, and that would save that oops from happening. True story. Okay, any more questions? Oh, yes. Diane, the trim tool has a jump stitch button that she didn't use. Maybe she should try that. Good thought, Diane. I need to look into that. You're absolutely right. If I had thought of that last night before this show, I would have figured out the answer to that before I came on air, but I didn't think of it. So I know there is an answer. Sue, saving master designs is something I was thinking about. Do you have a good way of naming them and organizing them? I don't have a great way, Sue. I do tend to name them with whatever the name of the pantograph is. So this one would be squared. And I do tend to make them king-sized because that's big enough for everything. And I can just chop it down. I can quilt a quarter of it if I want to. So it doesn't matter how big it is. I want it to be big enough for everything. So that's my only system so far. I don't have so many favorites that they're hard to find. I just have a list of them at this point in my saved designs. Look, sewing is complete, you guys. Yahoo! So again, this time I ended on the right-hand side, but again, I can see my stitching is perfectly within my basting. I'm so happy about that. It certainly is not the end of the world if it's a touch out and gets trimmed off. Like I said, there are quilters who do purposely stitch beyond and then just cut it off. But I like to challenge myself to make it fit inside. That's one of the things I quite love about freehand quilting, is that you can make it be perfectly inside the basting line. So I try to achieve that, honestly, with the digital quilting too, even if it's not critical. Okay, this time, while I'm remembering, we are going to pull the bobbin out because there's not enough for a third pass. So we're going to put a fresh bobbin in there. Actually, I was going to break and change, so let's do that. Let's just leave that bobbin alone, and we'll stitch part of it. And then we will manufacture a thread break. Can you imagine doing that on purpose? Why would we want to do that? So this is going to be the last pass. I did say it's a small quilt. To is not big. I do have a wheel on my long arm. I could walk around it and turn the wheel, but why take those extra steps? So again, I'm making sure that I'm doing however much ratcheting I need to do, I'm doing in the one fell swoop, because once I get it basted and in place, I'm not going to tighten it up. Not going to mess with that. So let's baste this down. I'm getting everything fairly straight and smooth, and then I'm eyeballing it, and I'm going to use the fact that my belts are on and that my machine will stitch a straight line. I'm going to, if necessary, you know, fudge the quilt a little bit as I go across the bottom to make it stitch straight. If there was unevenness in my quilt, if there was, you know, waviness or extra fullness, I would take the time here to pin that in a few places. The more waviness and wonkiness, the more pins, so that I was confident I would end up with a straight edge. But in this case, Laura's quilt is quite nicely straight already, so I'm not too worried about the result. All the way down to the bottom. So again, when I see that there's a little bit of fullness pushing out in front, I'm grasping what's already been stitched and tugging on it a little bit. That pulls what has not yet been stitched under the needle a little touch faster. And if I need to, you know, smooth down or pull down that edge, I will too, but it's actually stitching quite nicely straight. I always say that achieving flat and square is very cumulative, and I firmly believe that. There's multiple steps at which you can address problems or make small adjustments, and doing that in small increments is always better than ignoring it until all of a sudden you have a big problem. So that's what I'm doing in pulling this under the needle faster. If I did just let it go out in front, I would all of a sudden have my bottom edge would be running off crooked. It would be bunching up under my needle. I might have pleats. But in managing it in little bitty increments, I can handle it. And also, honestly, some of the checking that we did with each advance, right? Making sure that the seam lines were running straight. That too is one of the cumulative processes. If you are checking straightness and squareness with every pass, you are unlikely to have a big problem when you get to the bottom of your quilt, because you can make small incremental adjustments throughout. All right, basting is done. And by the way, the stitching can be done on BSR 1 or 2. I don't think that it matters which one you pick. I tend to stitch in BSR 1 most of the time, which is just the Bernina Stitch Regulator number 1, which has a tiny coasting feature, even when you're standing still or not moving the machine. When the computer is driving it, I do not think that it matters whether that coasting stitch is on or not. That's just kind of my default, is the BSR 1. Here's a little tip for free. Whenever I'm using these edge-to-edge clamps, one of the difficult things about them, part of there being a slim profile, what camera am I on? This side one. The channel that my fabric is going into is very, very thin. It's hardly even 1/8 of an inch, and I'm trying to slip the edge of my fabric into that. So where my seam is pieced, sometimes that can be tricky. So having a pin or a seam ripper or a metal nail file, any of those things will work to just kind of run along that groove and coax the fabric in. Likewise, if there's a bit of fullness or a bit of fraying or anything that just keeps it from slipping into that groove, a needle can be super helpful. It's just a corsage pin. Okay, everything is secured. We don't need, obviously, the magnets anymore because this bottom edge is secure, so we're good to go. So once again, we're going to line up our stitching. We're going to pick a point somewhere in the middle. Okay, apparently there's a question that I need to see. Judy, touch snap to grid. Yes, that is what I missed, was the touch snap button. And you know, this, you guys have, lots of you have been here many times and watched me doing the freehand work. And that is, I've done it so many hundreds of times that it's so easy for me to do it and talk at the same time and remember all the things. But when I come to doing things on screen, this is newer to me and it's not as automatic yet, right? So I missed that button, but we figured it out. Okay, that was the only one. All right. So I've lined up my needle fairly close. I've popped my spoon foot off so that I can see clearly. And now we're going to do that micro button again. So Sue, you were asking about this. Let me just make this a tiny touch smaller. Okay, the micro button, so it's lower left. I'll click on it a couple times so you can see it, right? See the bullseye?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so it's the little four-way kind of arrows. And when it's black, it's engaged. So what's happening on my machine sew head now is it says micro move, and I've got the 4 arrows. And I can actually choose tiny, medium, or larger increments as well. I've got it on tiny because why not? So I lower my needle till it's almost to the fabric, and now I'm doing my teeny tiny little moves. And that's perfect right there. So when I close the micro move, then my hopper foot goes back up and I'm able to put my spoon foot back on and it just snaps on and off. Super duper easy. If you missed the spoon foot earlier, by the way, it's this little cup-shaped foot. Different brands call them spoon foot, cup foot. But the curved bottom is key. And when you're coming to the edge of the quilt, this is what it skates over as opposed to catching that and stitching it down. Ask me how I know. I bet every quilter's done it at least once. Oh, sorry, I was not on camera showing this. I can do it here. I'll do it in the close-up, Dave. Spoon foot. Whatever your brand is, just the cup shape is the important part, and particularly useful at the outer perimeter of the quilt so it doesn't catch that tiny edge of fabric and stitch it down. So I always use the spoon foot when I'm doing a digital design, honestly. Okay, we're all lined up, so we're not touching anything. So let us reposition. We'll drop the guideline in place. We'll zoom in. So the last gray point on that line is where I want to go. Oh, snap to point. I'm learning. I'm learning. And again, if you were doing highly intricate and custom work, the teeny tiny fractions of this might matter. But on this design where my spacing is 1 inch, really close enough is plenty good enough, quite frankly. Okay, look at that. It's like magic. My design moved. Now, I'm looking at this, you guys, and I'm seeing, can you see this too? When I zoom in, my stitching line, the blue lines, that's what I'm going to be stitching next, is ever so slightly above my red box. And guess what? My machine is going to tell me it's outside the safe area. So now is the time to change that, quite frankly. So what I have to do is back up my quilt a little bit, probably only about 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch maybe, and I have to realign it, right? I've moved it now. I have to realign it now. I have to snap to that point again. But might as well do it now as do it later. So we're back to doing our micro moves once more. It's thinking. There we are. So all I'm doing is repositioning and doing it again because I saw that I was just outside the safe zone. Drop the guideline, snap to point. So we're aiming for that same gray point. Can you see where my cursor is if I make it big enough? That's the difference that I made from where it was before. And it's going to make a world of difference. Now look at my blue stitching line. It's within my red box. Can you see that? The blue is what we're going to be stitching next. The red box is my safe zone. We'll look at it bigger. Perfect. Lines up beautifully. Okay. This time I can see with my green start point, it's going to be starting on the right. So I'm going to go ahead and mark my left trim first, my right trim second, and then start stitching on the right. What am I doing? Trimming. First I have to line them up. Okay, red is ready. So I've clicked on the first one. I'm going to link up the second and the third, and that's all we need. trim, sew head, vertical, invert for the left-hand side, walk to the sew head and push set, and you can see it turn black. What I want to trim off, gone. I'm going to show you something just for fun, just in case at your quilt. Suppose that you have a quilt that is not square and you know it and you've done everything that you can, but it still is about a ½ an inch off. This is a cool thing, and this is fairly new to Bernina's system. When I choose my trim, if you look down at the third row in the trim line orientation, I have horizontal and vertical and angle. If I choose angle, it allows me to pick a point on the left and a point on the right, and it will actually angle that bottom line, which I think is absolutely genius. But in this case, I know that my line is straight because we did it with the belt on, and it's perfectly straight. So I've got my needle lined up with the bottom edge, sew head, leaving it on horizontal. Don't think I need invert on, push set. I did something wrong. Oh no, there it is, it's trimmed. There's just, you can see the blue below because we're not using that bottom edge, but it has in fact trimmed us a nice straight edge along the bottom. I will zoom in just a tiny touch and you guys can see it in a moment. By the way, are you finding this helpful? Like, is my thought process, while a little unorganized, enough to give you some idea of the steps that I'm following? There you can see that trimmed bottom edge. Now we'll trim the right edge. Like, I'm happy to hear feedback. I'd love to know if you're finding this helpful, and especially if you want to see more of these. They will not be super frequent, but I'm further inside than what, Mr. Producer, sir? Than the one above it? Well, I'm not going to move my quilt. It is so tiny, it's about a stitch's worth. But I can. You guys might as well see this. If I undo, look at that. It untrims with the undo button. And I'll move over just a little bit to the right. Excuse me. Hope that didn't deafen you. Vertical. Trim. Perfect. Okay, there's my green start arrow, kind of in the middle of the screen there. That's going to be my start point, but I'm going to go back to the full quilt view so you can see what it's doing. There are queued designs outside the safe area. We've seen this before. DQ and proceed. So now all that's queued up is the one design that I'm working on, and it's now green. Green for go. And it's just thinking and pondering a little bit. So I'm going to let it stitch one whole row across because I know for sure I have that much thread. And then in that second row, we'll do a break. Holding on to my top thread, pulling up my bobbin thread, hanging on to both threads. And we do this when we're freehand stitching too. Hang on to both threads and do that anchoring stitch, and then we're up and away. Good. Okay. Any questions? I'm going to get a sip of water. Shall I make that a little bigger and you guys can follow the cursor again? It tends to go to one side, Dave. There we go. That's the best I can get. I can't zoom it in anymore, particularly. You can see it going. Perfect. Okay, do we have any questions? Let's talk. Judy, do you have an option where you can center placement of your design? Maybe that will eliminate that stitching line in the corner. I don't think that's going to be my answer, Judy, although I kind of see what you're saying. If the design was shifted, I would avoid that, and that's probably true. But I think more likely there is a way that you can tell those jump stitches not to stitch. I'm sure that there is. I just don't know what it is, and I need to learn that. But you're right. That would be a good workaround, too. Tony, if you were doing one of your freehand designs, can the machine learn and store your actions so that you can overlay it on future quilts for automatic sewing that looks hand done? That's a great question, Tony. I'm not aware that it can at this time. I do know that the Art and Stitch program, there are ways that I can upload it into that, the drawing, the line art, if you will, and then I can create a stitching line, and then I can stitch it, and it would look exactly like my quilting. Yes, but again, that is a bit of a multi-step process and one I have not yet explored, but would like to in the future. It is a cool thing about Q-Matic, though, that is not true of all brands, is that the design program is built right into the Q-Matic. So when you purchase Q-Matic, that comes with it. So if you want to be a digital designer, it's all there for you. If you want to just edit and tweak purchase designs, that is there for you too. And it's fairly easy to do. Yeah. Laura, it's such a pleasure to see how you quilt my quilts. This is Laura, whose quilt it is. Thank you for going the extra mile. Hello from sunny Watsonville, California. And Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas to you too, Laura. Laura knows I love this squared design. I've done it a couple times lately on her quilts. So that's awesome. Roberta, this may be a duplicate. The line of stitching between passes might be because you used link to connect the rows. Try attach or group. Okay, good point. I'll give that a try and see if instead of linking, I can attach them. Great idea. Thank you. Janice, jump stitches on the Bernina sewing machine in embroidery has 2 squares representing the sewing nodes with scissors between them. Do you have one on your screen? I've also stopped my stitching tied off and did a % restart. I don't have Q-Matic system though. Most of that made sense to me, and no, I don't have the 2 jump stitches represented with the scissors between, but I do see what you're saying. Yep, I do see what you're saying, and I'll give that a try. Thank you all for chiming in with these good tips and being patient with really someone who is new to Q-Matic or digital systems in general. I appreciate it. Okay, any more? Mom and Pop Quilt Shop. Good afternoon from snowy, cold Nova Scotia. Hand pink waving. Have you got a woolen mitten on the waving hand? Just to be on the safe side, I know how cold Nova Scotia is. Sue. Yes. Please do more videos like this. It's been so helpful for me as a new long armor. So good. You know, and I know it is more specific to Bernina owners, but you're my people. And now that Bernina is what I run, it is sincerely my pleasure to take you along on my learning journey. Okay, so let's talk for half a second again about the new cruise that's upcoming while Stella is stitching. I mentioned more details about this earlier in the show. You might want to go back and catch those if you missed them. But Dave and I are hosting a Caribbean cruise in January of 2025, so a little more than a year away. The topic is machine quilting. I'll be teaching a couple of classes, and I've invited 2 other teachers along as well. One is Beth Ann Nemesh, who is she's an artist, and textiles is the medium she's chosen. She is a fabulous quilter and an amazing teacher. So she'll come with a just wealth of knowledge and ideas. And Sam Alberts, who is a YouTuber and definitely a custom quilter as well, a little more contemporary, and she just has a fresh look on designs and some new ideas that I'm not really seeing in the quilting world. So creative, so creative. So both these ladies will be coming along and teaching classes as well. In addition to the quilting classes, we're doing some business breakouts. We're all 3 of us entrepreneurial. So business breakouts about topics like, you know, videoing and storing a video library, using social media in a way that's smart and doesn't suck the time out of your day, pricing and communicating with clients, just all kinds of business related topics. We have at least one guest spotlight artist who is our friend Clement Lai. He's a videographer, and he's the one who has done a lot of our setup here with lighting and cameras and so forth. And so he's going to be recording the lessons. So all cruisers will get these recordings to refer back to. Clement has a lot of knowledge too, just about lighting and video angles and making things, dealing with things that we long armors do, like needles moving up and down or vibration, right? He's helped us work through some of those problems. So he'll be doing a business breakout as well. I do want to make clear the classes are definitely lecture style. So there will be cameras, close-up cameras on our work, and it will all be shown on the big screen, but there is not hands-on quilting on the cruise. This is why we're recording all the lessons and giving them to you so you can take them home and rewatch them and rewind them at your long arm so that you can really absorb the material that we're teaching. And we're working hard to make our class content be integrated, related between the 3 of us so that what you learn in one class you can apply in another and see how they all work together to suit the style that you quilt in. So it's going to be a fun time. It's going to be warm weather in January. Yay! That's what we all want. So really happy about that. Leaving out of Orlando, it's a week-long cruise. Our website, Dave will put that in the chat for you so that you can head to that website and see. It's also on my website, stitchedbysusan.com. There's a banner right at the top that'll take you right to that cruise information. You can find out the cabins, the ports of call, all the things. So one last note, we did make, if you've been on cruises, you know there's at-sea days and then there's in-port days. The port days, the ship is always offering excursions and things that you can do, parasailing and scuba diving and so forth. And we want you to be able to do that and have your holiday. So the classes are really bulked up on the at-sea days. But we do have a conference room that does have a sea view. So that's really fun. It's not foreclosed walls. And that's where the classes will all be held. So that's it, I think, on the cruise. I'm sorry? Okay, it's possible that I thought the classes are in the conference room. It's possible that I didn't get all that information straight because there's classes and conferences, there's breakouts, there's mingling sessions in the lounges. There's all these things that we've got going on, and I'm so excited about it. It all runs together in my head. But anyway, there's lots of fun stuff on the cruise. Head to the website to get confirmed, correct details. That's all there. So once again, YouTube, as always, is a free resource for you. But if you care to support this show, you can do that easily at buymeacoffee.com/stitchedbysusan. All the contributions that come in that way, we put toward equipment in our studio. So all the new lighting that we've installed this year, the new cameras that we've gotten and so forth. And it's all part of our effort to bring you the clearest, most informative, best camera angles that we possibly can so that you can join in our quilting sessions. So I've been talking. It's time to stop and do a thread break. Right there. Oh, darn, the thread just broke. What are we going to do about it? To start with, we're going to cut it to simulate the break. And I think we should have a close-up camera at this point, Dave, so that I can show what I'm doing. So let's pretend we've had a thread break. So I'm going to first determine why the thread break happened. And in this case, I diagnose, and this is fictitious, by the way, but I diagnose that we've run out of bobbin thread. So I'm going to go ahead and change the bobbin. And you notice that I just took Stella and moved her away from our area. And I'm going to show you how pretty easy it is to line it back up and get it to start stitching again. I don't have a lot of experience with digital programs, but I've never found one to be as easy as this one, as intuitive for relining up. So I'm really happy with that in my Q24, and I'm really struggling getting that bobbin in place. Where's the snap? Listen for the snap. There it is. Okay, so fresh bobbin is in. So that's my faux problem, and I've fixed it. Now I need to determine what this join is going to look like. So we've got a close-up camera view on. And I'm looking at, this is where my stitching ended. And I've got a light thread and I'm in a dark fabric. I really don't want my stitching, my join to be here, because what I'm going to do is stitch over top of it for about a ½ inch. There is not going to be lock stitches. So my locking is going to be that overlap, right? Knowing that, I'm going to put it in as unobtrusive a place as I can. And also, it's more secure to have your locking be within seam allowances just because you've got multiple layers of fabric. So I'm looking back thinking, now where shall I put that? And I see that I've just gone across a corner here. There's lots of layers of fabric there, and that will all help to secure it. So I'm going to undo some of my stitching to where I'm overlapping that by about a ½ inch, and that's where I'm going to make my join be. I know it's hard to see because my hand's in the way. Let's see if I can make it more visible for you. So I'm basically going to go right to the corner, and then I'm going to make my stitching restart right about at the beginning of this so that this is all overlapping. And boy, that's going to secure both what is here now and the new stitching that I'm going to put in. That's going to be well secured in all those layers of fabric, and I won't risk it coming undone. So my thought process had to do with the color that I was stitching over and those layers and where it would be most secure. So now in this system, all we need to do is line up our machine close to a stitching line, and instead of beginning at the start point, which is what we've done with each row, we're going to begin at the nearest point. So I just need to line up my machine close to where I want to stitch, and it's going to automatically pull that up for me. So I'm just going to push start stitching again. We'll ignore those cued designs, press green to continue sewing, and right here is where my choice is, at stop point or at closest point on design. I'm going to choose the closest point on the design. It's going to think for a minute and kind of get its bearings a little bit. And then we're going to be able to pull up the thread. It's thinking, it's thinking. It shifted just a little. I should have set it a little further away so you could see it adjust. But now we've got the same process as we had in the beginning, which is pulling up the bobbin thread. And I see that it's just a tiny fraction off, so I'm actually just, with my fingernail, pulling the fabric a little bit, and I'm going to take that top stitch one more time till I'm sure that I've got it perfectly in place. Yep, there we go. Now we nailed it. So I've pulled up the bobbin thread, I'm hanging on to both tails, and I push start. And it's going to begin again. And just like that, it is secure. It overlapped those stitches, and we are golden. So that's how simple it is to fix a thread break. Now, I don't mean to downplay how easy it is on this one because my stitching lines are so far apart. It's really easy to determine where that stitching will begin. If you have a design that's got, for example, some backtracking or a circle that it goes around or something like that, it might be more difficult to find which direction it's going to go in when it starts stitching. So there are a few more detailed things, like, for example, you can set it to start stitching like where the machine is moving but the needle's not going. And that can help you orient yourself. Okay, where's it going to begin? Where's it going to go next? And am I starting at the right place? And all of that can be helpful. But basically, that's the process. You just line it up close to the next stitching where you want to begin again and tell it to begin at the nearest point. And away it goes. I think part of the key is that you do have the overlapping stitching. The securing is the important bit to me. Well, matching up the stitching line is too, but the securing is really important. And sometimes I've done that process and been standing there watching it and I see, oh gosh, it's like a half a stitch off because maybe I leaned on the rail or something, right? And so if I see it start off like that, I'll just right away go and adjust it and undo that, 2 or 3 inches and adjust it and start it up afresh because I do want that join to be unobtrusive. And with that, folks, we're at the end of our quilt. I'm going to move Stella out of the way. And we're going to have a little chat about it, see if there are any more questions. And that's our Q-Matic project for today. I'm so pleased. It's so pretty. I'm happy with the thread choice. I talked about it a little bit at length earlier. Because there were these light hourglass areas in the quilt, I didn't want to do a dark thread because it would be so stark on those. So even though there's all these lovely jewel tones, there are mixed dark and light, well, medium to dark colors, I would say, in those fabrics. Anyway, I took that lightest shade and I went just a couple shades darker. So I've got this creamy tan kind of thread, and it blends nicely on the jewel tone fabrics and is a little darker than the cream colored hourglass shapes, and I think looks great overall. So when I take it off the long arm, I'll be able to check at the back for sure. How did I do with placing my quilt on that pieced area that Laura's got running through the middle? So if you're interested in how I did that, watch back at the beginning of the show. I showed the whole loading process and how I determined where that middle was and how to get my quilt on that when it's wound on my long arm and I can't see where it's going to end up, right? Okay, let's have questions. Just a couple, apparently. Val, I wonder if the basic idea is the same for other brands. And if you mean in terms of overlapping and starting at the last point, it probably is the same basic idea. They may use different terms, like starting at the nearest point, for example, might have a different phrase in it. And I I don't have a ton of experience with other brands, so I really can't speak to that in depth. So that's all I know about that. Sue, so far I don't have anyone to go with me on the cruise. Earlier you mentioned maybe having some kind of process to help people find a cruising partner. Any more on that? We haven't gone further on it yet, Sue, but it is on our radar for sure. Fortunately, we have a year of time, so we are working on that, and we will certainly let you know via newsletter and maybe even via future YouTube episodes how that progresses and how we're going to get people in touch while still maintaining levels of privacy there. So. All right, that's it for questions. You guys, thanks so much for joining me. Again, do leave comments or reach out to me if you have found this to be helpful and would like to see these Q-Matic style shows occasionally. I know lots of my viewers are Q-Matic users or at least Bernina users, and hopefully you find it valuable and helpful. And gosh, we'll learn a little bit together because every time I'm learning something new too. So I do appreciate your patience. I appreciate those of you who type in your ideas or tips or things that I could try. I really, really do appreciate that. That's part of this community and process of learning, isn't it? So good. All right, so these live and unscripted episodes always are aired live, and they usually are a project from start to finish. And I'm just welcoming you into my studio to see how I work on a thing, how I make decisions, and why. And so I welcome you to join them. We try and do them twice a month. They're always Friday morning, and they're always 9 a.m. Pacific time. So the next one will definitely be in January after the holidays. So I hope that you have a very wonderful Christmas season with those that you love. Or in fact, if you choose to spend it on your own, I hope it's a lovely one too. But I hope that you get to do some things that are really enjoying and nourishing to your soul. So from our house to yours, Merry Christmas, and thanks so much for joining us.